All right, I am here at EarthX 2019 at the Progressives for Immigration Reform booth, Our Carbon Footprint, with Leon. Leon, how do you pronounce your last name?
Kolankiewicz is how I pronounce it. In Polish, it would be Kolankiewicz, but that's not where I grew up.
Okay, so one more time?
Kolankiewicz or Kolankiewicz.
Kolankiewicz.
Right.
That's your pronunciation.
That's what I heard growing up.
So, why are you here at a booth about population stabilization?
Well, because population is one of the big factors driving human impacts on ecosystems and on the environment, and that has a bearing on environmental and ecological sustainability. Way back in 1972, in the journal Science, a paper was published by Paul Ehrlich, scientist at Stanford, and John Holdren, who was Obama's science advisor for 8 years, on the so-called IPAT equation. I equals environmental impact. PAT is population times affluence times technology. So population is one of the main factors measuring or accounting for gross human impacts on the Earth, on everything from biodiversity to carbon emissions, to impacts on watersheds, water quality, soils, forests, wildlife, and biodiversity. It is one of the underlying factors that accounts for aggregate human impacts on the Earth.
You know about Paul Ehrlich's Bet with Julian Simon, right?
I do, yeah.
Well, for any listeners or viewers who might not be familiar with it, would you summarize it?
Yeah, I think way back in the 80s, Julian Simon, a professor later at the University of Illinois and later at the University of Maryland and associated with the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank based in Washington, D.C., bet Julian Simon and bet Paul Ehrlich and his wife Ann and John Holdren again on what would happen to the prices of 5 metals. I forget which metals they were, but the hypothesis of the enviros, the Ehrlichs and John Holdren, was that as a result of growing scarcity, the prices of those metals should go up over time, right? Increasing demand for a diminishing resource.
Do you remember what year was the benchmark that they would settle the bet on?
I don't remember the year now. It was back in the 80s. It was some time ago, more than 25, 30 years.
But Julian Simon won that bet.
Julian Simon won that bet. I think it was, again, 5 metals and 4 out of the 5 went up, or all 5 did. Interestingly, if a few years had been added to that bet, he would have lost it because some of the prices had gone up instead of going down in that time period. And a lot of it, Paul Ehrlich himself admitted for many years that it was a mistake to have done that. That he and Holdren, I believe, and maybe some other scientists like the climatologist Stephen Schneider, who went from Colorado to Stanford, tried to bet Simon again, this time on 15 environmental parameters and what was going to happen with those. The level of CO2 in the atmosphere would have been one of them. Indices of biodiversity would have been another. The ozone layer another. But Simon was not interested in those at all because he was a market economist and a cornucopian who believed that the market would solve everything. Free enterprise, unshackled human ingenuity would solve any problems that increasing economic size and increasing populations would cause. That is, we would always produce enough geniuses to solve the problems that our ever-increasing ecological load created.
And what's your response to that argument?
My response is that it's magical thinking. That is, that there is something to it, and it has happened in the past in human history, that even with increasing numbers, we have increased our aggregate well-being. For example, when
I've noticed a lot of people who are anti-cornucopia, and they use the phrase magical thinking a lot. A lot of times, in my opinion, they use it incorrectly. How are you using that?
Well, the analogy that I often use is the magician pulling rabbits out of a hat and just being able to do it forever. Because by increasing the size of our GDP, our aggregate throughput of materials and energy through the economy, which again is a function both of per capita consumption and population size, you are increasing that load. Now, by ever increasing efficiency or discovering
I'll take one.
discovering new resources, you can, for a while, stay ahead of that. But once you exceed that carrying capacity, that whole theoretical concept of carrying capacity, at some point you're going to go into freefall, just given enough time. So I would argue that Thomas Malthus, for example, who, at a time when the world population hadn't even reached 1 billion yet, and now we're at 7.8 billion, had argued that the human population size would be inherently limited because basically for every for every mouth to feed, that would increase exponentially or geometrically, as he called it, but that the
food supply increases linearly,
linearly or arithmetically. But what he didn't account for was that technological revolution or the discovery of the fossil fuels, and they're coming to bear in a big way in the early 1800s, mid-1800s.
So Thomas Malthus is an interesting example because he was largely writing about the Irish starving to death, and as a good Englishman, he didn't have a big problem with that. In fact, you could see a lot of his writing, you can see his writing as a justification for not helping the Irish.
Right.
That this is just the law, the iron law of he didn't say thermodynamics. I don't think that was in use at the time, but basically this is just physics. I think the idea that population can grow geometrically while food supply is only growing arithmetically is ridiculous.
Right.
Because people are made of food.
Right.
You can't grow faster than your food supply. You can't outstrip
and
your
again,
food supply.
we've seen that through the invention of the large-scale exploitation of fossil fuels, the vast stocks of fossil fuels, that for a while, and that while may even be hundreds of years, we've been able to outstrip the rate of population growth. There are far more people in the world today, 7 or 8 times as many as in the time of Malthus. We're consuming much more on average, 50 to 100 times more, and yet we're better off than ever before. But to argue that process can continue forever is like the proverbial person falling off the Empire State Building and at the 38th floor saying, so far, so good.
Yeah.
That it can go on forever.
I've never felt better.
It's fun going into Freefall.
Yeah.
So this idea of carrying capacity works well when applied to wildlife populations. It becomes more problematic when applied to humans because of our ingenuity, inventiveness, technological prowess, etc. But to believe that we can escape certain ironclad laws of physics, such as the Second Law of Thermodynamics, I think is, again, magical thinking.
Well, Leon, let's do a longer conversation when we're back at our respective home bases.
Sounds good.
Thanks much.
Thank you.